Nobody ever asks the harder question. Thousands of articles, millions of comments, entire communities built around the same narrative. The narcissist chose the empath. The narcissist hunted the empath. The narcissist targeted the empath. It has become a kind of modern scripture, this framing, and like all scripture that goes unquestioned, it has begun to do more harm than the wound it tries to explain. Because embedded in that story is a lie so flattering to one side and so damning to the other that most people will never examine it. The lie is this: that one person in the dynamic was fully conscious, fully choosing, fully predatory, and the other was entirely innocent, entirely passive, entirely blindsided. Carl Jung would have seen through this in seconds. He would have sat with this narrative the way he sat with dreams and myths, not dismissing it, but asking what it conceals. And what it conceals is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth in all of relational psychology. The narcissist did not target the empath. Two wounds recognized each other. Two incomplete selves reached across a room, across a life, across a pattern neither of them understood, and locked into a dance that had been choreographed long before they ever met. That sentence will make some people furious. It should. Fury is often the first sound the shadow makes when it is seen. But stay with this, because what follows is not a defense of the narcissist and not an attack on the empath. It is something far more dangerous to the ego of both. It is the truth about what actually happens when two psyches, each carrying an unhealed fracture from childhood, find each other with surgical precision in a crowded world. Jung gave us the framework to understand this over a century ago, and it remains to this day the most honest map of human relationships ever drawn. So let us follow it. Not where it flatters, but where it leads. Jung introduced the concept of the complex, a term that modern culture has diluted into near meaninglessness, but which, in its original Jungian definition, refers to something extraordinarily precise. A complex is an emotionally charged cluster of associations in the unconscious, usually formed around a core experience of wounding, that operates autonomously within the psyche. It has its own energy, its own logic, its own gravitational pull. When a complex is activated, the person does not merely feel an emotion, they are seized by one. They do not make a choice, the complex makes it for them. They do not see the other person clearly, they see the other person through the distorted lens of their earliest, most formative pain. This is not metaphor. This is the mechanism by which two strangers can meet, know almost nothing about each other, and within weeks find themselves locked in a dynamic so intense, so consuming, so eerily familiar that both describe it as fate or destiny or the deepest connection I have ever felt. It is not fate, it is not destiny, it is two complexes recognizing each other the way two tuning forks vibrate when struck at the same frequency. The resonance is real, the origin is wound. Consider the child who grew up with a parent who was emotionally volatile, present one moment, terrifying the next, warm and then suddenly cold, affectionate and then punishing without warning. That child learns, at a level far below conscious thought, that love is unstable, that intimacy is dangerous, that the only way to be safe is to become exquisitely attuned to the emotional state of the other person, to read their micro-expressions, to sense the shift in energy before it becomes a storm, to develop an almost supernatural sensitivity to mood and tone and silence. That child grows into the adult the world calls an empath. Not because empathy is their nature, though it may be, but because empathy was their survival strategy. Their radar for other people's feelings was not a gift they chose to develop. It was a weapon they were forced to build in order to navigate a home where the emotional weather could change without notice or reason. Now consider the other child, the one who grew up with a parent who was absent or engulfing, or who used the child as an extension of their own unfulfilled needs. Perhaps the parent needed the child to be perfect, to perform, to reflect their own worth back to them. Perhaps the parent was so consumed by their own pain that the child's emotional reality was simply invisible. In either case, the child learns that their authentic self is not enough, that they must construct a version of themselves that is acceptable, admirable, unassailable. They learn to build what Jung called the persona, the mask the ego wears for the world. But they build it so thick, so early, and so desperately that it fuses with their sense of identity. By adulthood, they do not wear a mask. They are the mask. And behind it lies not a person but a void, a raw, aching emptiness where a self should have been. The world calls this person a narcissist, and it is correct as far as the label goes. But the label, like all labels, tells you what something looks like while obscuring what it is. Here is where Jung's framework becomes indispensable. Both of these people, the empath and the narcissist, were children first. Both were wounded by the same fundamental failure, the absence of what Jung might have called the relational container, the safe, consistent, emotionally present bond with a caregiver that allows a child to develop an integrated self. Without that container, the psyche fragments. Different parts of the self get split off, repressed, exiled into the shadow. And each child, using whatever resources they had, builds a compensatory structure to survive. The empath compensates by becoming hypervigilant, attuned, giving, self-erasing. The narcissist compensates by becoming inflated, performing, controlling, self-aggrandizing. These are not opposite pathologies. They are mirror compensations for the same wound. And this is precisely why they find each other with such devastating reliability. Jung described a phenomenon he called mutual unconscious contamination, the process by which two people, without knowing it, project their unresolved psychic material onto each other. The empath meets the narcissist and unconsciously projects the archetype of the parent they could never save, the wounded, brilliant, emotionally unavailable figure whose love always seemed just out of reach. The narcissist meets the empath and unconsciously projects the archetype of the perfect mirror, the endlessly accepting, endlessly forgiving presence who will finally confirm that they are valuable, that they are real, that the constructed persona is not a lie. Neither person sees the other as they are. Both see the other as a solution to an equation written in childhood. And the initial period of the relationship, the phase that survivors later describe as love bombing, is not merely a manipulation tactic. It is the moment when both complexes activate simultaneously, creating a resonance so powerful that it genuinely feels like transcendence. For a brief, intoxicating window, the empath feels chosen, and the narcissist feels seen. Both are wrong. Both are sincere. This is what Jung meant when he wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. He was not being romantic. He was describing a volatile process, one that can heal or destroy, depending on the consciousness each person brings to it. In the empath-narcissist dynamic, the consciousness is almost always catastrophically low on both sides. Not because either person is stupid, not because either person lacks intelligence or good intentions, but because the complexes involved are so deeply buried, so ancient, so perfectly defended that neither person can see them operating. The empath cannot see that their compulsion to give is not generosity, but a repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to re-enter the dynamic of their childhood, and this time, finally fix it. The narcissist cannot see that their need for admiration is not confidence, but a desperate attempt to shore up a self-structure that was never properly built. Both believe they are making free choices. Both are being operated by programs that were installed before they had language. Jung had a name for this pattern of repetition. He called it the archetype of the wounded healer, the idea that the person who is drawn to heal others is almost always carrying an unhealed wound of their own. The archetype is ancient, appearing across every mythology, every spiritual tradition, every culture's stories of shamans and priests and doctors who gained their power through their own suffering. But Jung was clear that the archetype has a dark expression as well as a light one. When the wounded healer is conscious of their wound, they can transmute their suffering into genuine wisdom and compassion. When they are unconscious of it, they become compulsive, driven to heal others as a way of avoiding the terror of their own unprocessed pain. The empath who cannot stop giving, who cannot walk away from a destructive relationship, who returns again and again to the person who hurts them. This is the wounded healer in its dark expression. Not evil, not foolish, possessed. Possessed by an archetype they have never identified, let alone integrated. And the narcissist is possessed by a corresponding archetype, what we might call the archetype of the empty sovereign. They sit on a throne of persona, ruling their interpersonal kingdom with charm and control and intermittent reinforcement. But the throne has no foundation. It is built over a pit. And the narcissist's entire life is organized around ensuring that no one, including themselves, ever looks down. The empath arrives and, for a while, provides the ideal floor, their ceaseless validation, their willingness to absorb pain without protest, their ability to see potential and beauty in someone who cannot see it in themselves. All of this serves the narcissist's deepest need, which is not to be loved, but to be filled. And this is the cruelest irony of the dynamic. The empath genuinely loves the narcissist, or at least loves the image they have projected onto them, while the narcissist experiences the empath not as a person to love, but as a function to perform. The dehumanization runs both ways. The empath reduces the narcissist to a project. The narcissist reduces the empath to a supply. Neither has seen the other. Both have seen only what their complex demands they see. At some point, the dynamic begins to deteriorate. The empath's giving exceeds what the narcissist can absorb without feeling exposed. The narcissist's taking exceeds what the empath can sustain without feeling empty. The mask starts to crack on both sides. The narcissist becomes cruel, not because cruelty is their nature, but because proximity to genuine intimacy triggers a terror so primal, so overwhelming, that they must push the empath away before the empath sees behind the persona. The empath becomes martyred, not because martyrdom is their nature, but because the moment they stop giving, the moment they assert a need, the complex whispers that they will be abandoned, just as they were in the original wound. And so the cycle tightens. The more the narcissist punishes, the more the empath tries to prove their devotion. And the more the empath proves their devotion, the more threatened the narcissist feels. And the more threatened the narcissist feels, the more brutally they push away. This is not a relationship between two adults. This is a collision between two children wearing adult bodies, each reliving a trauma they have never named. Jung wrote, "We cannot change anything until we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses." This is the sentence that should be inscribed above every conversation about narcissism and empathy. Because the dominant cultural narrative does exactly what Jung warned against. It condemns. It creates villains and victims. It gives one person a label that means irredeemable, and the other a label that means blameless. And in doing so, it traps both people in their respective complexes forever. The narcissist, confirmed as a monster, has no incentive to look inward. If they are fundamentally broken, why bother trying to heal? The empath, confirmed as a saint, has no reason to examine their own participation in the dynamic. If they were merely targeted, then the problem lies entirely outside them, and the only thing they need to do is find a better person next time. But they will not find a better person next time. They will find the same person wearing a different face. Because the complex does not select for personality, it selects for emotional frequency. And until the frequency changes, the pattern repeats. This is what Jung called the repetition compulsion, as it manifests through projective identification, the unconscious process by which a person not only projects their inner material onto another, but actually elicits from the other the very behavior they projected. The empath does not merely imagine that the narcissist is like their unavailable parent. They unconsciously maneuver the narcissist into becoming unavailable through their own anxious pursuit, their own desperate giving, their own refusal to hold the narcissist accountable. And the narcissist does not merely imagine that the empath is an endless source of validation. They unconsciously train the empath to become exactly that, through intermittent reward, through withholding, through the precise calibration of warmth and coldness that keeps the empath in a state of perpetual hope. Both are doing this unconsciously. Both are horrified when it is pointed out. And both are doing it because their complexes require the other to play a specific role in order for the internal drama to continue. There is a Jungian concept that illuminates this dynamic with almost painful clarity: the conjunctio, or the union of opposites. In alchemy, which Jung studied obsessively as a psychological metaphor, the conjunctio was the mystical marriage of opposing elements, the fusion of sun and moon, king and queen, sulfur and mercury. Jung saw in this an image of the individuation process, the integration of the conscious and unconscious, the ego and the shadow, the persona and the authentic self. But the alchemists also warned that the conjunctio could not occur without a stage of dissolution, the nigredo, the blackening, the painful decomposition of everything that had been. The empath-narcissist relationship, when it reaches its most destructive phase, is a kind of nigredo. Everything is dissolving, everything is coming apart. And the question that determines whether the experience becomes a tragedy or a transformation, is whether either person can endure the dissolution consciously. Can the empath sit in the blackening and ask, what part of me needed this? What wound in me made this dynamic irresistible? What have I been avoiding by focusing all my energy on someone else? Can the narcissist sit in the blackening and ask, what is behind the mask? Who am I when no one is watching? What happens to me when I allow myself to be seen without the performance? These are the questions that lead to individuation. These are the questions that most people will never ask, not because they cannot, but because the pain of asking them feels worse than the pain of repeating the cycle. Let us go further into what actually binds these two patterns together at the level of the unconscious, because the surface explanation, the narcissist is a predator and the empath is prey, fails to account for a phenomenon that anyone who has been in this dynamic knows intuitively but cannot articulate. The pull is mutual. The attraction is not one-directional. The empath is not merely drawn to the narcissist, they are compelled toward them with a force that feels biological, cellular, fated. And the narcissist, for all their supposed emotional blankness, often reports the same intensity in reverse. This mutual pull is not chemistry. It is not coincidence. It is what Jung would identify as synchronicity operating through the personal unconscious, a meaningful convergence of inner states that manifests as an outer event. When two people carrying complementary wounds meet, something in the unconscious of each recognizes the other as necessary. Not necessary for happiness, necessary for completion. And the unconscious does not care about happiness. It cares about wholeness, even when the path to wholeness leads directly through devastation. This is the hardest thing to accept about the Jungian framework. It does not offer comfort. It does not tell you that the narcissist was evil and you were good, and the universe owes you a kinder partner. It tells you that the psyche is a self-correcting system, that it will engineer precisely the experiences it needs in order to bring unconscious material to consciousness, and that the most painful relationships in your life were not accidents, they were invitations. Invitations to see what you have been refusing to see. Invitations to integrate what you have been projecting. Invitations to become whole in a way that comfort could never achieve. Jung expressed this with characteristic precision when he wrote that, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." He did not add a qualifier. He did not say some pain or manageable pain. He said pain, unmodified, because he understood that the ego will fight the unconscious to the death, that the persona will defend itself with every weapon available, and that the only force powerful enough to break through those defenses is suffering that can no longer be explained away. The empath-narcissist relationship provides exactly that kind of suffering. It strips both people of their favorite illusions. The empath's illusion that love can heal anything, the narcissist's illusion that performance can replace authenticity. And when those illusions fall, if the person allows them to fall, rather than immediately reconstructing them, what remains is the raw material of a genuine self. Not the constructed self, not the performing self, the real one, which has been waiting all along. There is a practical dimension to this that must be addressed, because philosophical understanding without practical application is merely intellectual entertainment. If you are someone who recognizes yourself in this dynamic, whether as the empath, the narcissist, or perhaps uncomfortably as both, the question is not, whose fault was it? The question is, what was the wound? Jung would say, go back to the original fracture, not to the relationship that broke you, to the relationship that broke you before that. The first one, the one with the parent, the caregiver, the original mirror that was supposed to reflect you back to yourself, and didn't. That is where the complex was formed. That is where the emotional frequency was set. And that is where the real work must happen. Shadow work, in the Jungian tradition, is not an abstract spiritual exercise. It is the painstaking, often agonizing process of identifying the parts of yourself that you have exiled, the needs you have denied, the emotions you have suppressed, the desires you have labeled as shameful or dangerous or unacceptable, and bringing them into conscious awareness. For the empath, shadow work means confronting the hunger for control that hides beneath their giving, the rage that simmers beneath their patience, the narcissistic need for specialness that their identity as the one who feels everything has been designed to satisfy. For the narcissist, if they are capable of and willing to undertake this work, which is rare but not impossible, shadow work means confronting the vulnerability that lies beneath the grandiosity, the terror of annihilation that drives the need for constant admiration, the grief of a childhood where the authentic self was sacrificed for a persona that could survive. Neither of these processes is possible within the dynamic itself. This is crucial. The empath cannot do their shadow work while still functioning as emotional supply for the narcissist. The narcissist cannot do their shadow work while still using the empath as a mirror. The dynamic must end, or at minimum, the unconscious patterning within it must be interrupted, before either person can begin to see clearly. This is why the act of leaving the narcissist for the empath is not merely an act of self-preservation. It is the first step of individuation. It is the moment when the empath stops reaching outward for completion and begins the terrifying, necessary turn inward. And the grief that follows, the grief that survivors describe as the worst pain they have ever experienced, worse even than the abuse itself, is not merely grief for the lost relationship. It is grief for the lost illusion. It is grief for the fantasy that someone else could make them whole. It is the nigredo, the blackening, the death of the old self. And if it is met with consciousness, rather than with a frantic search for the next relationship, the next project, the next person to save, it becomes the soil from which a genuine self can finally grow. Jung believed that the self, the totality of the psyche, the archetype of wholeness, communicates through dreams, symptoms, and what he called meaningful coincidences. He believed that every crisis, every breakdown, every moment of unbearable pain carries within it a message from the deeper layers of the psyche, urging the individual toward greater integration. The empath-narcissist relationship, when viewed through this lens, is not a mistake. It is a communication. It is the self saying, "This is what you need to see. This is the wound you have been avoiding. This is the shadow you have been projecting onto others. And now, through this devastating experience, you have the opportunity to reclaim it." That opportunity is not guaranteed. Many people cycle through the same dynamic for decades, never pausing long enough to hear the message. They leave one narcissist and find another. Or they become so identified with the label survivor that the wound itself becomes their identity, replacing one persona with another without ever touching the underlying material. The internet, with its endless supply of narcissism education content, can actually make this worse, providing a sophisticated vocabulary for understanding the other person's pathology, while offering no vocabulary at all for understanding one's own. The empath who can list every trait of narcissistic personality disorder, but has never examined why they stayed, why they chose, why the dynamic felt like home, that empath has done research, not healing. And research without integration is just another form of avoidance. Jung said something near the end of his life that has haunted many students of his work. He said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Note the word privilege, not right, not inevitability. Privilege, because most people will not do it. Most people will choose the familiar pain over the unfamiliar freedom. Most people will rebuild the old structure rather than stand in the rubble long enough to discover what wants to be built in its place. The empath-narcissist dynamic offers a doorway. Not a gentle doorway, not a door lined with flowers and soft music, but a doorway nonetheless, a threshold between the life organized around an unconscious wound and the life organized around a conscious self. Crossing that threshold requires something that neither empathy nor narcissism, in their defensive forms, can provide. It requires honesty. Not the performance of honesty, not the curated vulnerability that looks like openness, but is actually another form of control. Real honesty, the kind that admits, "I was not merely a victim, I was a participant. My wound chose this person as surely as their wound chose me. And the only way out of this cycle is through the center of myself. That admission does not excuse the narcissist's behavior. Abuse is abuse. Cruelty is cruelty. Manipulation is manipulation. Naming one's own participation in a dynamic does not diminish the other person's responsibility, but it does something far more important than assigning blame. It restores agency. The empath who admits their participation is no longer a passive object that things happen to. They are an active subject with an unconscious pattern that can be understood, examined, and ultimately changed. They are no longer at the mercy of the next narcissist who walks into the room, because they have begun to understand the signal they were broadcasting and the frequency they were tuned to. They have begun, in Jung's language, to withdraw the projection, to stop seeing the narcissist as a fated character in their personal myth and start seeing them as a human being whose wound happened to interlock with theirs in a way that produced catastrophic results. And this is freedom. Not the cheap freedom of moving on, of being over it, of finding someone better. The deep freedom of knowing yourself, your shadow, your complex, your wound, your pattern, with such clarity that the old dynamics simply cannot form. It is like changing the frequency of a tuning fork. The old resonance becomes impossible. Not because you have become stronger or smarter or more guarded, but because you have become more whole. And wholeness does not attract fragmentation. Wholeness attracts wholeness. That is not a romantic platitude. That is a psychological law, as observable and as reliable as gravity. When you integrate your shadow, you stop needing someone else to carry it. When you integrate your wound, you stop needing someone else to replicate it. And when you finally see yourself, all of yourself, the light and the dark, the giver and the taker, the healer and the one who needs healing, you become, for the first time, genuinely available for a relationship that is not a repetition, but a creation. Jung devoted his entire life to the principle that the unconscious is not the enemy, it is the source. The shadow is not the villain, it is the unrecognized ally. The wound is not the curse, it is the invitation. And the most destructive relationships in your life are not proof that the world is cruel, but proof that your psyche is trying, with enormous, desperate, persistent energy, to make you whole. The narcissist did not target the empath. Two wounds met in the dark. Two incomplete selves reached for each other, not out of malice, but out of a longing so deep that it predates language, predates memory, predates everything except the body's earliest experience of what it means to need and not receive. To see this is not to forgive. It is not to excuse. It is to understand. And understanding, as Jung knew better than anyone, is the beginning of transformation. The question is not whether you were wounded. Everyone was. The question is whether you will let the wound remain an unconscious program that selects your partners, dictates your suffering, and repeats your childhood until you die, or whether you will turn toward it, face it, name it, and integrate it into a self that is finally large enough to contain everything you are. The choice is not between pain and comfort. The choice is between unconscious pain that repeats and conscious pain that transforms. And if you choose the second, if you choose the harder, lonelier, braver path, you will discover that the person you were looking for in every narcissist, in every unavailable lover, in every relationship that promised wholeness and delivered devastation, was never outside you. That person was always inside, waiting in the shadow, holding the missing piece, ready to be welcomed home. That is what Jung meant by individuation, not perfection, not transcendence, homecoming.